Hello everybody. I am going to play with a little bit of some backgrounds today, and I thought I'd bring you along and show you what I was doing. There's a couple different ways you can achieve this effect, and I'm going to do, for this video, just for sake of time, I'm going to do just one of them, and I'm going to try to use materials that are not commercially made, although you can use commercially made like stencils with this technique, and I will show you that. But today I kind of wanted to do a 2-for-1. So I'm going to use some lace, and I'm going to use my little stack of smaller pieces. I'm going to work small again today. You can do this like on a bigger scale on larger pieces and cut them up. This is kind of the effect that I'm going for. This was in my journal, and this was done with gesso. And today I think we're going to use a little bit thicker application. So I'm going to add some plaster of Paris or joint compound to my gesso and see what the results I'm going to get are. This was done with a stencil and gesso, and then I put a fluid medium on top to kind of get that really neat. It's a resist technique, I guess. Again, another one that I used a stencil on. So we're going to start by mixing together some regular white gesso, and I'm going to use plaster of Paris and try and get a thicker consistency, and I just do this in a little jar. This does keep, so if you want to do a little bit bigger like quantities of it, you can. So I'm going to do like about not quite a cup of the gesso. Make sure that I'm in. And then I'm going to add to this, I'm going to start with a quarter. So I have about, like, let's say I have a half a cup. I'm just going to use about a quarter cup of plaster of Paris and mix it in. My gesso was a little bit thicker to begin with, so I might not need too much of the plaster of Paris to make the consistency I want. But what I'm looking for is, since I'm using vintage laces today, and they vary in like thickness, I just want something a little bit thicker that's gonna kind of catch all of those grooves. And the plaster also makes a really neat resist when you add other mediums on top of it. So that looks about right. You can kind of see the grittiness in there. It's the consistency of like a cake batter, like a thick cake batter, and that's what you want. You can also do this technique with just a straight joint compound. I like to add in some matte medium if I'm using this. It gives it a little more flexibility and not the cracking, but cracking's cool too. So if you're looking for that like aged appearance, just stick with it straight out of the bottle. So, okay, so for sake of time, I just want to do a couple of these real quick because I want to dry them, and then I want to add the liquid, fluid. You can use fluid acrylics. I'm going to be using these little spray inks, I guess they're called. I have a stash of these, and I'd like to just use them up. So I had those on hand. If you don't have those on hand, you could use watercolors. Watercolors are not going to be water soluble, so if you put anything else on top of them, you might want to like spray them with a fixative. But the other cool thing about this technique is you're going to also end up with some plastered lace. So that's really cool. So get yourself a pretty big space because you want to lay out your lace as you go. And I really tore it up so that I don't have any like straight edges on most of these. This one did, but I would probably just go in and like rip it up a little bit more. So I have these like jagged edges. So, and I'm gonna take, you can use a lot of different things that you have on hand for the application. I like this little tool for working smaller. You can also just use a plain old paintbrush. These are from the dollar store, a spatula. That works really good. But yeah, those are some of the ideas. You can also just use your tongue depressor to do it too. So I'm gonna start just adding that. You're gonna wanna use your hand to kind of keep your piece still and kind of work from the top and just press a pretty good blob of it in. It'll start to stick in, which is nice. And you don't want it to move it around too much, but you also aren't looking for a perfect impression. You really want that like worn look. So don't worry about if it slides around a little bit. It's just going to give it extra character. So you see I'm kind of, to keep it from sliding, I'm kind of taking a big amount and I'm just smashing it like straight on. And then you can kind of scoop up the excess. And I also like when I'm not completely covering the whole page and that's leaving some variance in your piece too. So I'm going to pick that up and kind of look at what I've got going on here. So this is very bold and there was some pieces that were a little bit like subtle, and I'm going to use that again over here. I'm just going to give myself another little application. Basically just really smashing that in there. Pretty. So if you see anything where maybe it's like too high, you can kind of come in and just give it a little swipe. But that would be our first piece. I'm going to set this other piece of lace over flat so it will dry. And I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to do this piece. This is an old piece of book page. This piece is gessoed with clear gesso. Let's see, let's take one that's not and see how it holds up. Vintage paper is really fun to work with, but it really depends on the book that you get it out of. Sometimes they're brittle and they'll fall apart, but sometimes they're very strong and they won't. So just play around. Again, I'm going to try and stick, not going edge to edge here. I want those edges and the excess of the paper to stick out. So again, just taking my material and going straight down onto the lace. This piece is a lot easier to work with, and you'll find that too. You'll have some pieces that just will fight you every step of the way, but this one's really nice. Peel that off, and there is a really neat impression. So I like that. I might come in here and kind of play a little bit on the edges with some of these. But you can see it's a really neat impression. So the plaster, as I'm playing around with this, is definitely more bulky than the pages out of my journal that I showed you, which is cool. And every little piece is going to give you a different feeling, impression. So I'm going to go in, I really like those little flowers, so I'm going to try and see if I can get some of those to show up. Now, if you want this a little thinner, you can kind of go back over it and scoop up some of it. But that's really cool. So I'm gonna let that one be. And then you've got your lace that's plastered, that's gonna dry too. So if you have a big area to do this, you can do a lot of pieces at the same time, which is really nice. Or you can just do like a little bit like I did, and not make a huge mess. But when you're working smaller like this, it's really fun. Okay, I'll do one more piece here. So I have a little bit left in here. Just go ahead and use that up. I would say when you're working with the lace versus like a stencil, you're definitely going to get a messier, more organic print with your plaster. I like that because I want to not, like, I want there to be mystery in my piece, and for the interest to be like, well, what is that? Like, how was that achieved? So I do like trying different pieces and stuff, but that's another piece there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dry these, and then we're going to add some of the color on top, and you can see how the resist, I don't know if I showed you this. This is my little stash of lace that I'm working with. All right, so I'm going to take my dryer and I'll dry these quickly. You can leave them if you're working in bigger quantity. If you're working in bigger quantities, just you can leave these to dry, and it usually takes a few hours. Here in Colorado, probably where it's more humid, it might be an overnight thing. I'll let those dry for a moment, and then I'm going to grab another piece of white because I think that will show up a little better. So I'm doing this piece with a little bit of a thinner lace because I think it'll dry quicker. And so I'm going to go ahead and dry that. And you can use these a couple times. That one's very delicate, and I love the way that's turning out. So I'm going to do just a little bit less material. And you can scoop quite a bit off. So you want your pieces pretty dry. I'm rushing this a little bit, and we will see how it turns out when I add the fluid acrylic to it, or the ink. But let's just play around since we have those done. And I'm going to use a brush, and I'm going to dip it straight into my, I'm going to use this brush, kind of a thicker watercolor brush, and I'm going to gently work, since these aren't completely dry, I want to be a little more careful with my application. And it's good to have like a little extra water nearby if you want like a more if you want to add some water, it kind of gives your pigment, it's not so pigmented. And I'm going to use a couple different colors of blue on this one and kind of blend them together. I tend to go a little more like vintage colors in my work, so I don't like that super bright necessarily. But you can use that and then add things to it to make it workable. And then you get that depth. And you want like the variation of like the watercolory look. You know, add water and kind of spread it out. And I'm dabbing this. I'm not like rubbing it in because my resist is still a little bit wet. And I'm using quite a bit of water. This is a watercolor. I think this is actually a mixed media paper, so it will take a lot of wet mediums on it and not go too rogue. And I like to leave like these little variable spaces that maybe didn't pick up the pigment. Be a little bit mindful of that. You can always add more layers. So kind of use a little bit of a restraint in this first layer. And when it dries, it definitely changes when it dries. So I'll just kind of go back in and pick up some of these puddles that are happening. So this is not as interesting to me as I would like it to be. So I'm going to grab one of my little stamps. So I have some carved stamps that was in another video here on YouTube, how I do these. And I think I'm just gonna try and get some little variation. It's still a little bit wet. And yeah, so I'm just gonna add that there. That way it's not just completely flat. But when you do add, you'll see that little bit there. So that's another good thought too. If you feel like you got too much height because your lace was thicker, you could also come in and just flatten it out like with a flat piece. Or you could use a texture piece and just add a little more texture to it. So I really like that. That's really cool. You're going to get that extra bit of interest. But really pretty. I'm going to set this one aside and we're going to, let's do this one. Go ahead and just use the same two colors. A green would be really pretty too on these, but just experiment. They're super fun. So this is the piece of vintage paper that I clear gessoed before I added. And it's still a little bit of wet, so I'm going to keep doing that little pouncing action. Dipping in, adding water. So when I make these, I'm thinking about using these in a larger project. So I'm not thinking this as a whole. I'm thinking I'm going to probably cut these up to use in collage or in journal pages. So I'm not super concerned with every spot on here. There's going to be some gems in this that I am going to use, and then there's going to be some parts that just didn't work, and that's okay. I'm going to go in again. These are pretty thick. And I'm going to add some more dimension. You could also just go back in with like your lace and add some of that too. So. All right, let's do one more piece, and then I'm gonna let them dry because they look so much different when they're dry. I'm gonna do pretty light on this one. So this particular brand of spray ink, which is Lindy's, is a permanent, more of a permanent application. I know there's some spray inks out there. Different brands are a little less or more reactive with water. But once this brand dries, it's pretty stable and you can add things back on top of it and it doesn't move around too much, especially if you heat set it. So that's really cool. I'm gonna add a little like drippage on that one. See? Okay, one more. Let's try this one. So with this craft paper, it's going to be a little darker, but still really cool. So you can see this piece is a little more dry, so I'm able to use my brush in a different way. I'm not having to pounce. I can really get it in there. Super cool. All right, I'm going to dry these and then come back and we will kind of look at what we got going. Okay, so I'm taking a look at these. I absolutely love these. These are my favorite. I'm going to leave these just as they are. When things are completely dry, you can come in and take a wet wipe and kind of wipe off some of that top layer, and you'll get a little bit more variable if you want more white coming through. So you get more of that white. This one turned out really good. So these are not like doing it for me. So I think I'm going to come back in with that favorite piece that I found. The little more delicate lace worked a little better for me. And I'm just going to add in a few more details where it's dark, especially on this cardboard or the cardstock. The brown paper, it's gonna need a little more pop there. So I have a little left over and I'm just gonna go in randomly and just add some little extra pieces. And this is kind of a grid, so maybe I'll just grid in every area. So even like the pieces that you're just like, ew, that turned out horribly, or I really don't like that. Don't let that freak you out. Don't throw it away. Just keep adding. And sometimes these are the pieces that I love the very most. They have much more story behind them and dimension and detail. And that's what's always fun about doing this technique, is that you just don't know. You can't really plan what you're going to get exactly. And especially if you start using some different materials that you're not used to. There's a lot of freedom in that. So I'm going to add one more little piece there. I kind of like this little area with the little boxes. So at this point, I am kind of paying more attention to detail, of the details that I want to include. And I'm going to do the same on this piece, but I'm going to just throw this whole thing over there. And I'm just going to try and avoid this middle where it's already pretty thick. I don't want to add any more thickness to this piece. And if your piece is too thick, you can sand this material with a little sandpaper to knock some of the edge off. If you want it a little bit thinner. So I like that added dimension to those edges where it was a little crazy. And I like that it varies the smaller imprint with the larger. So I'm gonna keep going. And I like that, the pop of the white on top of this blue and green watercolor effect. I think it's really pretty. So again, I'm like looking in here and I'm like, you know, I know that I'm going to probably make this smaller, but it's still just bothering me that that's like that. So I'm going to add a little more just right on top there. Yes, much better. One more piece there. I'm just going to finish this off. That. So there is a really quick, fun technique for dimension and collage papers using plaster of Paris, gesso, and paper. And of course your little bit of lace. I'll show you some of these, how these are going to dry, and then we'll come back and I'll do another video on how I use these pieces in my work, and we'll play with that. Thank you so much for watching and playing with me today. I've enjoyed this technique, and I'll be back with I'll do another one with the stencils. But thank you for joining me. We'll see you soon.